So I'm very pleased to introduce our fifth panel, Access Denied to Information. And our panelists include Prateek Mittal, Jennifer Rexford, Barbara Van Schewick, Phil Weiser, Jillian York, and John Markoff is our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So our panel consists of several technologists with strong views on policy and several policy thinkers with strong views on technology. So I hope we have a lively discussion. I hope we don't agree on everything. So our focus today is on denial of access in all its various forms. And I just wanted to note that in America today, it seems that walls have come back in fashion. We're not dealing with physical walls. We're dealing with virtual walls. That's going to be our focus. And I wanted to begin because I grew up with a particularly idealistic generation of internet users. And I was very influenced early on by an internet privacy activist. His name was John Gilmore, John Gilmore. He was one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And he was quoted in Time magazine in 1996 as saying, "The net interprets censorship as damage and routes around it." And this was a very sort of strong and political statement. And I wanted to begin by asking the entire panel, perhaps in whichever order you feel comfortable with, if this is still true or whether it was ever true. So, well, Prateek, why don't you start?
I can go first. So let me consider this question from two different perspectives. The first is the perspective of the core internet protocols, namely the TCP/IP protocol. And second is the perspective of the broader internet ecosystem, which may involve higher-level applications. So from the perspective of the core internet protocols, I have to disagree with John Gilmore. In my opinion, the net has never treated censorship as a defect and was able to route around it. The internet protocols were designed to be extremely simple, and they're not able to interpret a censorship event and respond to it. So think about sending a postcard to a particular destination, and if the postmaster intentionally drops that message, there's not much you can do. You can try resending the same postcard, but that doesn't change the outcome. However, if we interpret this question from the perspective of a broader set of internet applications, then we have some limited ability to bypass censorship. So let me give you the example of the Tor project for anonymous communication. The Tor network today is a system that comprises of roughly 7,000 geographically distributed proxies all over the world. Users who wish to communicate anonymously can redirect their messages using a series of proxies to be able to communicate with a particular destination. So this helps mitigate certain types of network censorship. So today, Tor is widely used by several million users, including journalists to protect the privacy of their sources, including political dissidents, including, in some cases, law enforcement and intelligence agencies. A couple of high-profile recent examples that come to mind are Edward Snowden, who's a user of Tor. And this network was also widely used in the events of the Arab Spring.
So I agree with Prateek. The internet was never designed to route around censorship. It routes around failure, or the complete failure of a part of the network, not the selective failure of it just to drop a certain portion of the traffic. And also the routes that the traffic does take through the internet are driven dramatically by economics. You know, where is the content you're going to actually hosted? It may be that you can't avoid censorship because the country that's hosting the data is the one you're trying to avoid. And also what traffic goes through what countries is something we don't control very well either, and that's driven by economics as well. So we did a study at Princeton where we looked at how routing for users in lots of different countries to those countries' own popular sites goes. And if you look just to take Brazil as an example, more than 80% of traffic from Brazil to popular sites that Brazilians want to go through the United States. And that's either because that content is actually hosted in the US or because the only way to get there is to go through Miami first. And the same is true for users in Kenya and other parts of Africa where they go through Amsterdam or London to get to where they're trying to go. So where fiber is located, where business relationships exist, where content is hosted, where popular hosters of content locate their business have a profound effect on what countries people go through and whether they're subject to censorship or surveillance when their traffic goes there.
Yeah, and I would add that the ability of someone to route around obstructions also depends on where exactly the blocking happens. So in the context of net neutrality, we often have this debate that people say, well, maybe if your ISP blocks or discriminates against traffic, you can evade that by using certain technologies such as encryption. And it turns out that just doesn't work. If your ISP is who controls your access to the internet, short of switching to another ISP that does not block your internet traffic, there is little you can do, because even if you encrypt your traffic, technology is now so powerful that ISPs have a lot of insight into where the encrypted traffic is going, or sort of based on the characteristics of the traffic, what kind of application you might be using. And so there too, the conclusion is there is no routing around the blocking. At least in the end, the ISP always wins.
So what I would add is the John Perry Barlow view of cyber anarchy has yielded to a need for cyber governance. And so topics like network neutrality, like privacy, like cybersecurity, and what Brad Smith said earlier today, are part of an emerging discourse around cyber governance that accepts the fact that the internet is not able to function, let's say, in this distributed utopian way where every person can protect him or herself. This was a nice idea. I can see why it's attractive, but it wasn't true then, and it's more plain now why we need governance and why public values have to be part of a discourse around what the future of the internet's going to look like.
Finally, Jillian.
Well, I guess I'm in the awkward position of disagreeing with my organization's beloved founders when I say that, of course I agree with my fellow panelists that this was never technically true, but I think in addition to that, historically, first, we've had a number of countries that have always restricted the internet. Saudi Arabia didn't allow its citizens online until 2001, and that was after they already had the mechanisms in place for heavy censorship that remains true today. The other thing that I would add to that is that I think that today's censorship doesn't look like that. Today's gatekeepers are nation states, yes, but in addition to that, today's gatekeepers are companies, including some of the companies that are represented here today, Microsoft, Facebook, et cetera. They're often the ones colluding with nation states to censor speech, as well as applying their own standards as to what they find acceptable on their platforms.
And yet, clearly there is, you talked about Tor. I was in China last year, and I was struck. I was told that I had to be aware of surveillance, so I went into China. I took a clean laptop, and what I found was I was almost blind because I couldn't reach Gmail, I couldn't reach the New York Times, I couldn't reach Twitter, and yet it turned out that most of the Chinese citizens that I interacted with had no problem. They could get there were enough sort of, the wall was porous enough. So to what extent has the world sort of escaped balkanization? I'm asking this in the context of Snowden, that in the wake of the Snowden disclosures, there were calls around the world to balkanize the internet. I think Brazil talked about things. Russia and China are still talking about alternative structures. Could you give me a sense of what the consequences of Snowden has been, both inside the United States and out? Would somebody like to take a
I can take that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think a couple things. One is the use of encryption on the net just increased significantly after the Snowden revelations. A lot of websites started turning on HTTPS. A lot of users started doing encrypted email and the like. So that's one. And second, that means that to really look at people's traffic, that hacking the end device becomes important. And so certainly people who wanted to wiretap or surveil had to do it in other means. Either they would look just at metadata, which does reveal a lot of who's talking to whom, even if you don't know what they're saying, or they would hack their own end devices where you have access to the data before it's encrypted. And I would say a second thing is a lot of countries, as was mentioned in one of the earlier panels, have moved towards efforts to keep their traffic local by hosting content locally, by using applications that are available only in their home country, or by installing fiber. For example, Brazil has installed the fiber to Europe just to avoid the United States. And so there's changes to the actual core infrastructure of the internet to make it possible to avoid countries that you don't want handling your traffic.
I can also add to that. So I think one interesting consequence of the Snowden revelations has been an increased awareness of privacy risks in online communications. So in particular, Snowden indicated that the NSA has a program called Marina that collects metadata information about us for the period of, and stores it for the period of 1 year. Similarly, the British intelligence, GCHQ, also has a program called Tempora that stores metadata information for the period of 30 days and full buffer information for the period of 3 days. So we now have to start thinking about our network providers, our ISPs, as potential adversaries who might compromise the privacy of our information. What's worrisome is that these entities have actually colluded with network providers to even compromise the privacy of Tor users.
So I want to take it from a slightly different angle. The internet grew up with the US having been the steward, so Vint Cerf here is sort of a special role, maybe Godfather is certainly one description, and many of the institutions, including the domain addressing system, were overseen by the US government, and in the wake of Snowden, that became unsustainable because the international suspicion that the US was abusing its privileged position got to such a fever pitch that had the US tried to keep control of the addressing system, which was handled by a contractor and then a international nonprofit that the US helped set up called ICANN, I don't know that that would have been stable. And so the US sought to then create a now independent international nonprofit, ICANN, with a council of governments as part of it to be a ideally legitimized form of civil society or multi-stakeholder governance. And that's directly traceable to Snowden. There are still some suspicions of ICANN. Its tradition has not always had as much view in terms of its operations being fully transparent, but this is an early precursor for what a multi-stakeholder system of governance can look like that can keep the internet community together. Because one of the threats, as you note, John, is you can have a fragmented internet, and the extreme versions of that, people in the internet in China or Brazil literally aren't and can't communicate with one another. That has not yet happened, but I don't believe we can take for granted that we will truly keep an international internet for the next several generations.
Yeah, and I want to add that part of what makes the data localization question really tricky is that it might have different implications for different countries. So there is sometimes your own country might be have more privacy-friendly laws, or you trust your government more to not just survey or access that data in bulk. So a lot of Germans might think that our privacy laws are particularly strong, and so they might feel better about their data being stored in Germany as compared to the US, where if you are not a citizen, there isn't a lot to protect you, and even if you are a citizen, there might, it's very easy for the government to get access to data that is stored in the cloud. But then flipping that, if you are China, then you have an incentive to keep data local because that makes it easier to survey. And part of what's interesting is that states that want to control and surveil use other states' sort of maybe more benign attempts to protect their citizen as an excuse to say, see, Germany is doing this too, so we as China can do it too, even though the motivations are very different. But it's a hard problem because at the same time, the data localization does make it a lot harder for startups to serve users in different countries. If you have to store your data locally, then it becomes a lot harder to get off the ground and reach people around the world, where before maybe you just ran your service from the US and everybody can access it. So it's tricky.
Jillian, you're based outside of the US. Inside the US, it looks like there were meaningful reforms as a result of Snowden. Could you sort of touch on what it looks like outside the US?
Well, so a little bit. So I'm based here in Berlin. And of course, there's been a lot of opposition here toward what was happening with the NSA and the revelations, as well as Germany's cooperation. And so if you look at some of the great organizations locally, like netzpolitik.org, they've been tracking all of this, going to parliament, following all of the inquiry here in Germany. But I want to take it just a little bit outside Europe for a second, and also kind of add on to something that Barbara said, that one of the direct effects of the Snowden revelations, as I see it, is an increase in surveillance by other states. And I'm talking outside of Europe, outside of the United States. We've seen Egypt, for example, buying up new tools from Western companies to surveil their citizens more intensely than they have been. We've seen this happening across the Middle East, in Turkey, in a number of different places. And I think that sometimes, just as Barbara mentioned, sometimes this is used, or the US's behavior is used as justification for more intense surveillance elsewhere, and that's really troubling.
So this is outside the notion of intelligence agency collaboration. This is domestic intelligence gathering. It's not Seven Eyes or anything.
Indeed, and we don't know what, if anything, the US shares with some of those countries.
Yeah. I wanted to take a slight detour because I thought Brad Smith, I think he's gone now, but Brad Smith of Microsoft today made a really quite dramatic call for the sort of the moral equivalent for a digital age of a Geneva Accord. We have this new kind of warfare. It's been relatively bloodless so far, but it is war. Information warfare. I was wondering if you could, if any of the panelists have thoughts about sort of how to implement or the challenges to implementing a new kind of normative basis for warfare.
So I found that proposal very appealing and timely. The point I made earlier about governance and emerging institutions underscores that we are now in a vacuum. The norms around privacy, cybersecurity, international collaboration are very much emergent and can go in different directions. So one of the post-Snowden directions could be mistrust, recriminations, anything goes. Other directions include more a la Geneva Convention, a sense of there's certain things that countries and actors, both private and public, should not do. And we want to help drive behavior towards those norms, and we want to create space for a body like, and he mentioned the International Red Cross, who can be a neutral, technically able to support efforts towards the sort of behavior we want to see. This is, to my mind, a promising future direction. I want to underscore it's really hard to do this. So a body that wants to be a trusted intermediary, like the International Red Cross, has to build its institutional fabric in ways that show its legitimacy, that it operates transparently, that civil society groups have an ability to participate in. This is not easy work. This is going to take effort. The US companies and US government entities can't do this alone. It has to be truly an international effort. If we don't do this, I do worry about the fracturing of the internet and the lack of norms. The ability of one country to do this doesn't exist, and the legacy institutions like the International Telecommunications Union are not perfectly positioned for this. So I found his proposal very appealing.
Prateek first.
Just wanted to follow up on the last point that Phil made in terms of highlighting some unique challenges when it comes to internet warfare. So our network communications were not designed with notions of accountability and attribution in mind. And this is very different from conventional notions of warfare. So if we think about attacks based on, say nuclear missiles, it is relatively easier to attribute those actions to particular countries. But in the context of network communications, if, say, Princeton University is seeing an attack, it's very hard to hold the perpetrators of those attacks responsible because they potentially have plausible deniability. Hey, it wasn't me.
I'll just add one thing. I found Brad's proposal very compelling as well. I just think one thing he mentioned that I found a little difficult was the distinction between private infrastructure and public. The idea that it would not be appropriate for a nation state to attack private infrastructure, but when one country's private infrastructure is another country's public. Is the network private or public? Is the power grid private or public? In some countries it's one, and some it's the other. So these services that in the US are highly privatized are public goods of a sort, and so it's not exactly clear how to classify them, particularly when other countries would have them as public infrastructure. So it wasn't clear to me if those should be in or out of being viewed as private infrastructure.
To push on the attribution issue a little bit more, it's been such a deep and thorny problem and at the heart of many of the basic crisis issues that face the internet. Is there anything on the horizon that suggests a way out? I mean, attribution was one of the points that he put at the very center of this. If it's impossible to do, it's a very difficult situation. Technically, is there anything that gives you hope?
It would require significant architecting the core internet protocols to be able to come up with strong notions of user identities on the internet. Yeah. So conventionally, our network identities are IP addresses, which may not uniquely signify an individual user. So for example, in this particular event, we may all be potentially sharing a particular IP address that's our interface to the external world.
Jennifer, in your network design stuff, is there anything that you can see that would help with attribution?
I mean, I agree with Prateek. A lot of the identifiers you see in internet traffic are put there by software, and so they can be put in there erroneously to signify something else other than yourself. So it does make it difficult. There's some best common practices that ISPs can do to make sure that their customers don't use addresses that don't belong to them. So there's a certain amount of defensive programming, if you will, that can be done to make it harder for people to spoof their identifiers. There are technologies for what are called self-certifying identifiers. So you could imagine the Ethernet card or Wi-Fi card in my laptop could have an identifier in it that can't be forged by others, but that would require new Ethernet cards on many of our devices. So I do think it's possible, but it requires a fair amount of upheaval or a fairly significant adoption of better practices by large carriers. And that's a challenging space because getting 50,000 separately administered networks all to adopt a common best practice is a challenging endeavor. And having national organizations like this Red Cross kind of thing might help with that, but it certainly is logistically challenging at best.
Just to follow that a little farther, because it's such a critical point, there have been efforts at Stanford and SRI, DARPA-funded efforts elsewhere to start over. They're called clean slate efforts. Is that an absolute non-starter at this point? Is it too late to start over? I think that the one thing Bob Kahn, sort of the other father of the internet, if you will, said to me when we were working on the early days of the clean slate effort, he said, if you're going to reinvent the internet, you have to do it when no one's paying attention. And everyone's paying attention. And the first time around, they had the luxury that nobody took them seriously, and they could get a lot done before people realized that there was something interesting going on. That said, I mean, a lot can be done under the guise of naive researchers doing something new that maybe we can be not taken seriously and get far enough along. So I do think there's hope there, but I think the incremental deployment topic is a challenging one. And this is where I think actually there's really interesting collaboration opportunities between economics and computer science to really understand how economic incentives to incrementally adopt technology, whether it's security technology or other technology, could be quite fruitful, and it hasn't been enough of that quite yet.
So on this point about no one paying attention, it's incredibly important. When the internet was first being developed, AT&T had some conversations. Would they be willing to operate some of the core backbone networks? And the use of packet switching, a different form of transmission, was viewed quite skeptically by AT&T, and they said, oh, this thing will never work, and if it did, it would displace us, so why would we ever support it? So AT&T didn't take it seriously, didn't try to control it. The open architecture internet grew up in this era where no one was paying attention. That open architecture was dependent on standards, which were helped develop from the group, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Now, fast forward, it's big business. How can the standards group develop open architectures, standards that serve public goals, privacy, security, when people are paying attention? This is not an easy thing to do, and governments traditionally haven't had to worry so much about standard setting. That was some nice little thing done over here by engineers, but yet the outcome of these standard setting bodies have huge implications for public policy. So again, we're in this moment where we're trying to find our way through. For a while, we were able to ride on the wise decisions of the early internet pioneers. Now we have to think about re-architecting it. I don't think we're going to do it from scratch, but we do have to keep upgrading and enhancing, and that's going to take collaboration when different people are looking around saying, wait, what's this do for me? And that's going to be one of the hard issues to work through.
So there is a really interesting concept. So one question is the deployment problem, but another problem is that when you talk about integrating public values into the infrastructure, different countries have very different values. And then different players in the ecosystem do have very different values. And so one concept that David Clark and colleagues have thought about was this idea of designing for tussle, where the idea is that you design the technology in a way that it can support different outcomes, but it doesn't force a specific outcome. So it might be, you support application agnostic network management, but that is not the only choice. Or you support privacy options, but that's not the only choice. But it leaves the door open for those countries or players that want to deploy the technology in a way that supports these values. And I do think if you don't do that, then many countries will legitimately say, I don't want to buy into your values, and so I just don't want to deploy your technology.
I just wanted to play off one point that Phil made about the role of government. I think you're right that government has largely not paid attention to standards. There's one anecdote I found interesting. I was involved in a FCC working group on trying to incrementally deploy better security technology for the core protocols of the internet. And one thing that several of the companies involved in that group said to me privately was, please put in this document a requirement from the US government that they will not buy a router unless it has a crypto chip, accelerator chip in it. Because my boss won't let me put one in because it'll be more expensive and the customers don't want it. But if the government says it has to be there before the government will buy the equipment, I'm allowed to put it in. Right, and so I think government can make equipment requirements that can at least start us on future-proofing. It doesn't solve all the incremental deployment challenges, but it avoids people buying equipment now that's going to be incapable 10 years from now.
Did you put it in a document?
In ways, but not as much as we would have liked to, because there were other people resisting it. I think there were ISPs that didn't want that in there because they didn't want to be obliged to pay for it either.
Just to quickly add to the conversation, I think it's really important when we're thinking about clean slate designs and re-architecting the internet. We not only think about issues of attribution and accountability, but this is also a good opportunity for us to bake in notions of privacy and censorship resilience into the core fabric of internet protocols. So for example, I hope to see one day application layer anonymity protocols like Tor be deployed into the core network architecture.
And that you would do that through an IETF process as a set of protocols?
Potentially.
Yeah, okay. You haven't done it, though.
Not yet.
Yeah. So the United States, of course, is in the midst of this complete reset. Let's start with net neutrality. Is it dead in America? Let me start first by asking you what the situation is.
Yeah, so net neutrality, as most of you probably know, is the idea that the internet service providers that connect us to the internet shouldn't control what we do online. And in practice, that means that you adopt rules that prevent them from blocking websites, from favoring some websites over others, for example, by slowing down the ones they don't like or speeding up the ones they do like. And then the third component is that most net neutrality rules now prevent internet service providers from charging content providers to pay to be in a fast lane. And the first two are basically motivated by the idea that internet service providers shouldn't be gatekeepers that pick winners and losers online. Part of what makes us so excited about the internet is that everybody can play, and you want it to be a neutral playing field, whether with respect to our economy or to our democracy. The prohibition on fast lanes is based more on the idea that you want to keep the cost of innovation and speech low. Part of what's been special about the internet was that it doesn't really cost a lot to develop new application, and it doesn't cost a lot to speak on the internet. And that has allowed all sorts of people, students in their dorm room and innovators in their garage, in the economic context and small businesses, and then in the free speech context, nonprofits, independent artists, bloggers, to speak and reach people online on the same terms as the large, big corporations. And so net neutrality rules are designed to maintain this beneficial environment. So as most people know, in 2014, 2015, the FCC, the American regulatory agency in charge of telecommunications, adopted very strong, meaningful net neutrality rules after a very public debate in which more than 4 million people commented to the FCC, went on the streets, burned down the switchboards in Congress. And now we have a change in administration, and Chairman Pai, the new Republican chairman of the FCC, has said that he wants to take a weed whacker to sort of get rid of unnecessary regulations, and he has talked about it in a way that suggests that that includes at least part of net neutrality. But what's really tricky about this in the US context, and that's sometimes hard to see from outside of the US, that in the US there are two different debates that are intertwined and that make net neutrality a more tricky subject for Republicans. And that's, one is the question of, do we have a problem and do we need rules, net neutrality rules, to address that problem? If that was the only question, at least sort of in the mid-2000s, that was basically a bipartisan issue that both Republicans and Democrats supported net neutrality rules. And in 2014, 2015, 85% of conservative voters supported the idea of net neutrality rules. So while there are Republicans in Congress that have said, we don't need net neutrality and it's a solution in search of a problem, I see sort of the potential for more common ground there. What makes this so tricky is that all of this is tied up in a debate over jurisdictional foundation. So in the US, net neutrality rules haven't been adopted by Congress in law. You know, in Europe, net neutrality rules were adopted by the European Parliament, and then the regulators adopted implementing regulations that closed some of the loopholes. In the US, the FCC has adopted net neutrality rules, and so it needs a hook in the law. And originally it used one hook, so-called Title I, and then in 2010 when they adopted rules, and then in 2014 those rules were struck down by the courts, arguing that the FCC, for reasons in the Communications Act, cannot adopt meaningful net neutrality rules under this jurisdictional hook. The court said, if you want to have the kind of net neutrality rules you seem to want, you need to do that under a different part of the Communications Act. That's the so-called Title II. Now, you might wonder, you know, why do we care about all of this? We care about all of this because there is stuff in Title II that the internet service providers absolutely hate. So there is a potential to adopt rate regulation and unbundling. And so they have fought tooth and nail to get net neutrality under Title II because they are really concerned about the FCC adopting those kinds of rules in the future. The FCC decided to lift those rules, arguing they are not necessary. So we could say this is just a hypothetical concern, but the reality is that that drives a really strong resistance by ISP to be regulated under this title of the Communications Act. And so bringing this all together, if you listen to Chairman Pai, what he's really concerned is Title II. He calls it government overreach. And so he has said, you know, I'm going to roll back Title II and move internet services back under this other part of the Communications Act. The problem with that is once you do that, you cannot actually have meaningful net neutrality rules at the FCC. And so many people have said, all of this means net neutrality is dead. You know, Trump in 2014 or 2015 at some point said, oh, net neutrality is the fairness doctrine for the internet and we need to get rid of it. Most people think he didn't necessarily understand what exactly net neutrality means, and his movement that brought him into office actually depended in many ways on net neutrality. And his economic policy of creating opportunity and jobs also depends on net neutrality in a very important way. And so I think the future of net neutrality is up in the air right now, and it ultimately depends on all of us how this story will end. Because in the same way that in 2014, 2015, the 4 million people and this huge public pressure in support of net neutrality created an environment that allowed policymakers to overcome the strong resistance by the ISPs, you know, who are among the most well-funded, well-connected corporations in the country. The same kind of public outcry is something that Republicans don't necessarily want to sort of trigger. And if you compare that with the fact that startups, small businesses, large businesses, whether they are tech companies or normal companies that rely on the internet to reach their customers, have all been supporting net neutrality, suggests that there might be a solution. But all of this depends on sort of people fighting to protect this. Because if they don't, then it's very clear, sort of then the default is going to be the FCC reverts back from Title II to Title I. At that point, they can't do net neutrality. And then if Congress just touches net neutrality without strong public pressure, they will end up adopting a net neutrality law that's net neutrality in name only.
To give you a quick gloss on that, I believe that the FCC will discover what Congress is in the midst of discovering with respect to the Affordable Care Act, that it's much easier to say we're going to get rid of it with a weed whacker than to actually change a policy that has a lot of popular support and has become normalized, even now, many in the industry. And this is the conundrum that Barbara mentioned. At this point, the ISPs would say, we accept the rules of the road from net neutrality. We've become comfortable with those norms. We just are really spooked out by Title II, which means in a functional world, this would get settled in Congress, which means the ISPs wouldn't say, get rid of all net neutrality, instead just create a new title of the act that can justify it outside Title I or Title II. I don't know if we'll get to that place, but I would predict the place I don't think we will get to is going back to no net neutrality at all, because again, the norms of net neutrality around non-discrimination, free and open competition for all, and the free speech values have become so popular that I don't see us going back on them.
I'll just add one point. I think the other challenge in net neutrality is it's typically cast in terms of the carriers, right? AT&T, Comcast, and so on, and whether they treat one bit differently than another. But in practice, the large companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft have as much say on how open our experience on the internet truly is, and they're not subject to regulation. And I'm not saying they should be, but it makes it a complicated space where it's very uneven. Just to give a few examples, what does my app get in the App Store or not? Is determined by Apple or by Google, not by AT&T or Comcast. I was just tell a short anecdote from some work at the FCC I was involved in. We're looking at the FaceTime application, the popular video chat application that Apple put out. Well, in 2012, they started making it available over cellular networks, but AT&T decided not to support it for users of its unlimited data plans. And this caused a huge amount of consternation in the fall of 2012, and AT&T's violating net neutrality, and so on. And if you look under the hood at that, there are a number of interesting things there. One is that application came preloaded in the calling features of the phone by Apple, not as an app, available to 100% of customers. Even now, only 10% of people have Skype installed on their phone, because it takes an actual effort to put Skype on your phone, whereas FaceTime is there automatically. And it's a very high bandwidth application that Apple was choosing to be more aggressive than other applications in using network bandwidth, so that even a small handful of users of FaceTime could lock out all the capacity of a cell tower. And so, not to say that Apple's the bad guy here either, but it's a complicated dynamic. AT&T's decision when it had a huge number of iPhone users with unlimited data plans to block access to an app that came out of nowhere that would be such a high bandwidth user on so many phones, created a really complicated dynamic. And the FCC only had authority to talk about AT&T's involvement in the conversation, not Apple's, which I think makes it quite difficult.
Prateek.
Let me also offer a perspective on network neutrality that's driven from the viewpoint of political internet censorship. So we're living in an era of surveillance and censorship where our access to information is being monitored, controlled, and in many cases denied. So many countries in Southeast Asia, Middle East, for example, China, are blocking access to websites such as Facebook, YouTube, WikiLeaks, and even technologies for resisting these types of censorship. I think I have a statistic which I think is attributed to Jillian, which illustrates that roughly half of the worldwide internet users are living in a country where access to internet is either censored or restricted in some way. In terms of Jen's comment on corporations playing a role in this, there was a very recent and interesting example that connects this to the Tor network that I introduced earlier. So in the last decade, we have seen the rise of large content distribution networks on the internet. These are large companies like Akamai and Cloudflare that host some of the most popular websites on the internet, including websites like Netflix, Yelp, and so on. And it turns out that many of these content distribution networks are blocking access from the Tor network. So Akamai blocks roughly 60% of the Tor network. So if there's a website that's hosted by Akamai, such as the popular Yelp recommendation service, then 60% of the Tor users will roughly not be able to reach this website.
Prateek, do you know why?
This has to do with internal access control policies that these companies want to enforce. These policies work fine for users who are not using privacy technologies like Tor because it's easy to do rate limits based on some IP addresses. But for users of privacy technologies like Tor, all of their traffic is first funneled into the Tor network, and then these content distribution networks get to see the IP addresses of the Tor network. So this significantly confuses their internal algorithms for access control and end up blocking and discriminating against users of privacy technologies like Tor.
I just want to add to the why, which I think is that a lot of, that these companies, for better or worse, for worse really, see users of Tor, users of circumvention technologies as malicious users. And it's true that there are malicious users on these networks, but the vast majority of these users are people who are using Tor to remain anonymous or to circumvent censorship. And in some countries like Iran, this is absolutely vital to their ability to access any kind of information at all. And so I actually think, that what these companies, and I hope we'll come back to company control in a bit, but I think that what these companies are doing is almost unconscionable at this point.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on Jen's comment about sort of focusing exclusively on ISPs in the context of the net neutrality debate. And there is actually an interesting broader question here which comes up in many different policy debates. So the debates over privacy regulation in the United States, the debate over net neutrality, where the internet service providers always say, so why are you focusing on us? Why are you adopting special rules for us? There are these other big players that have a lot of market power, and you adopt different rules for them. And so it's sort of a recurring theme. And from my perspective, I do think, one, internet service providers do have a very special role in the internet ecosystem because they see everything. They are sort of at the source. So with respect to privacy, that means they have a unique view of everything we do, which from my perspective would allow to adopt more stringent regulations on them. And with respect to net neutrality, if the internet isn't open, as we said sort of in the first round of questions, you can't route around that as a user unless you have sort of an alternative provider that doesn't block or discriminate. If Facebook doesn't show my stuff because of their algorithms or whatever, I can still get to use it. So I'm not trying to downplay here that the power that Facebook has over access to people, especially once you are on Facebook, is very significant. But I still think there is a structural difference, which from my perspective justifies making sure we get sort of the lowest layer right first. And then I think we need to look at powerful information platforms and absolutely ask ourselves, sort of, is there a problem here? And yeah, today a lot of those platforms both have a lot of market power that then translates into huge power over who gets to speak and be heard online. But then I think we need to look at those questions separately, and as we did with net neutrality, ask, one, are existing laws already helpful in addressing some of these questions, like antitrust law with respect to some of the economic questions there? And then to the extent there is other stuff, do we need new laws? But I do think those questions are separate and should be looked at separately.
So if I could pick up on this governance thread and a really important point about the collaboration. So the example of AT&T is a good one. Right now, if there's not a trusted intermediary where AT&T and others who use the application can have conversations about what are best practices, you can end up in this game of chicken where the application provider might say, hey, I'm going to be more greedy in the bandwidth I use, I'm going to use it less responsibly because I'm going to blame the ISP when anything goes wrong. And that form of finger pointing and a lack of collaborative problem solving is one of the risks that we now face in the internet. There is an organization called the Broadband Internet Technical Advisor Group, BTAG, founded by colleagues of mine at the University of Colorado, that's aimed at providing a forum to avoid such finger pointing and to create the norms around collaboration. The FCC has encouraged participation in it. That's the sort of effort we need to see more of here, because many of these problems are not going to be solvable by one entity alone. You need to create forums where they can come together and create norms for collaboration. We've been talking about net neutrality and, if you will, the last mile issue, but there's a related issue in the internet backbone and how internet backbone providers exchange traffic. And to the extent that is done in ways that may not be transparent or collaborative, there's also a potential for this finger pointing, an even game of chicken. We can have backbones stop interconnecting traffic and have users pay the price for that. So we users have a lot of benefits that are on the line, all of which can be compromised if key internet players aren't able to develop norms and institutions by which they can solve the problems that in running such a complex system.
So if the network neutrality situation devolves in the U.S., what happens between players, big players and little players in the backbone? Are there
so right now, as part of this order that Barbara mentioned, internet backbone players are subject to FCC oversight, and the FCC said if there are denials of interconnection, refusals to interconnect, breakdown, they can investigate it after the fact, and that backstop creates some pressure for entities to behave in their agreements to interconnect. If the FCC says we are taking no position here at all, then we end up with a law-free zone, which in the realm of telecommunications in the US and internationally, there has generally been a legal norm and backstop around interconnection. And so, in theory, a party could say, I'm not going to interconnect with you. Users could have traffic that might become inaccessible, and this is not entirely hypothetical. We had one of the carriers, Cogent, which is quite aggressive in threatening to play this game of chicken, and Sprint let it play it out. The state of Maine actually lost internet access for 3 days while this dispute remained unsolved. And so, yes, if we don't have government oversight around interconnection here, you could end up with private parties playing a game of chicken and users being the collateral damage.
Yes, so, and Phil right now is talking about interconnection in the backbone. There is a question of interconnection that is even closer to net neutrality, which is that when the FCC adopted net neutrality rules in 2010, they only apply to what's happening on the user's access network. But it did not cover the points at which data flows into or out of Comcast or AT&T's or T-Mobile's access network. So the interconnection was the last mile. And what was really interesting to see is that once blocking, discrimination, charging fees to content providers was prohibited on the access network, the ISPs realized, well, wait a minute, we can do the same thing, reach the same effect at the point of interconnection. So instead of blocking someone's traffic as it travels across the network, we can block it as it enters the network. And that actually created a huge problem because there was a moment where Comcast was complaining about the amount of traffic that was coming in from Netflix. And so they said to Netflix, we're not going to upgrade the point of interconnection unless you pay us. And so it led to a situation where all the unpaid routes into Comcast networks were congested. And so the only way to get good quality interconnection was to pay. And Netflix at first thought, oh, we'll just tell our users that the only thing that's going on here is Comcast playing games with interconnection. But when they started to lose users across the country who just couldn't use Netflix anymore, at some point Netflix caved and then paid. And so part of what the FCC's open internet rules said were, we are not adopting specific rules, But we bring the point of interconnection under the net neutrality regime, and we make very clear that you shouldn't use that point to circumvent the open internet rules. And if you think you are being treated in an unjust or unreasonable way, you can come and complain to us. And that has totally shifted the playing field for negotiations where, Cogent Level 3 were all complaining that these big providers want to be paid for access to their users, where we would say, or Cogent Level 3 would say, well, we, the users, already pay for the traffic that comes across that network. And so they were all preparing complaints after the FCC's open internet order was adopted, and then never filed them because the threat of complaint and regulation was enough to bring both parties to the negotiating table and to reach solutions that were less intrusive. And
so one quick point on that, I think another thing to think about there is Comcast also has a cable TV business they were hoping to keep users on. And so Netflix having crummy performance had another economic incentive for them. So they perhaps have more incentive than most to take that approach.
What's worth noting about Netflix is Netflix has now finally made it. And so Comcast is now promoting Netflix.
Yep.
So this is an important point, though. Whether it's Netflix or Google, they're not the best poster children for network neutrality because they've already made it. They're going to be fine. They've got market power in these bilateral relationships where it's hard for one side, the broadband provider, to really mistreat them. It's the upstarts, it's tomorrow's Netflix and Google's who we're worried about when we talk about net neutrality.
Jillian, you brought up the idea of corporate censorship. Is it a net neutrality issue potentially, or is it something separate?
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah, and I think it's something separate as well, and I'll start from that point. And historically, we think now of the nation state as the only body, the only authority that has the ability to cut off speech. Historically, that wasn't true, of course. Before the nation state, you had the church, and so on and so forth. And today, we have the giant corporation. So if you look at these different companies, and I recall on a panel yesterday, someone had sort of hypothetically proposed, well, what if these companies started enacting their own rules? And they already do. And so I'm going to use a really blunt and obvious example, but one that I think has the potential to shift culture, and that's the fact that Facebook, YouTube, most of the common platforms that we use, Twitter and Tumblr are two exceptions, but almost every platform we use, as well as a number of private storage hosts online, ban nudity. And I don't know if some of you have been walking around the past couple days. If you don't live in Berlin, you may have noticed that there's quite a bit of nudity on posters on the streets here. You see it in advertising, you can see it in magazines, even at children's eye level. It's quite common. And I think that this is, honestly, it's a form of kind of digital colonialism. These companies are going out there, imposing these rules on users all over the world, and there's no path of recourse. There's no due process. You can get banned from these platforms, either temporarily or permanently, for breaking the rules, and it can affect your work, as it did when Facebook blocked me for 24 hours for sharing a breast cancer campaign. So, I think that it's not just nudity, it's also terrorism, it's also all of these things. Now, some of these things might be things that we would like to see gone. I recognize, of course, that most people don't want beheading videos in their feed, and I think that that's a pretty reasonable thing. But I think that we should be asking who the censors are these days. Do we trust a company that has a 100% white and mostly American board to make these decisions? In that case, I'm referring to Facebook, but it's true for a lot of these companies. There's not a whole lot of diversity in the decision making. And do we want a system where we have no democratic process, no accountability for these kinds of decisions? And I do think that that's where we are today when it comes to online censorship. We're looking much more at corporate governance than nation-state governance.
So one thing I would point out here, when companies are going to need trust and they become not trustworthy, they may surrender some autonomy to have trust intermediaries oversee their decisions. Just recently, Facebook on, I believe it was for advertising purposes, said we're going to have some outside auditing to see whether or not the so-called Facebook users are legitimate people who are watching the ads, because if questions were raised, were they selling actual people to advertisers, or were they bots? And that could happen in other contexts where, again, there starts to be a lack of trust in the companies so that they are going to cede some autonomy and oversight to other bodies who will oversee decision-making, which could include things like terms of service. It could include things like, are they representing accurately their numbers? In one measure that is a little bit in this direction, and this was responded in part to a US law that has governed sort of the notice and takedown and other copyright policies called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. A number of ISPs working with content providers are in something called the Copyright Alert System, which governs notice to users if they're doing something that looks to violate copyright law. So under the Digital Millennium Copyright Law, broadband providers have to have some type of repeat offender system. Here, this collaboration tried to develop what a best practice would look like, giving people notice before doing something. That, again, is an experiment. We have to ask whether it includes civil society groups, is it diverse, et cetera. But it gets to this point about a lot of times companies may start saying, you know what, we don't want to keep sole control in our own hands for this because we realize this is important stuff. Who else can we look to for guidance?
Prateek, you...
I think since we're on the subject of social networks and fake bots, I wanted to highlight a form of censorship that does not rely on networks, that does not rely on corporations, but it relies on third parties on the internet, including fake bots. So this was an example that I, in fact, used in my academic job talk while I was interviewing at Princeton, and I think it continues to be relevant today. So after the Russian elections in 2011, we saw citizens resort to using Twitter as a medium for an online protest. The way this protest worked was as follows. That citizens would tweet protest messages using a hashtag that corresponded to the Russian word for elections. And the idea was that other protesters could then search for the same hashtag and obtain messages that were relevant to them. So very soon after this protest started, we saw the emergence of roughly 20 to 40,000 fake Twitter accounts that started to use the same hashtag to send spam. Now, this isn't spam in the conventional sense of selling fake watches or Viagra, but this is spam in the sense of denying legitimate citizens access to legitimate messages in this protest. Because now with hyperability, if you search for this hashtag, you will encounter a randomly generated message from a fake bot. Right? So the underlying technical issues behind why this attack is possible is because we don't have good notions of user identity on the internet.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I wanted to follow up on Jillian's point about sort of the private platforms now controlling a huge part of what's become the new public sphere. And that has some interesting legal implications, where in Europe, or for example in Germany, the government has an affirmative obligation under the Constitution to make sure that there is a diversity of speech in the context of free expression. So our constitutional right to free expression imposes an obligation on the government to act to preserve free expression and diversity. And that makes it relatively easy, not totally easy, but comparatively easy to impose regulations on those kinds of platforms if they become really important players that control public debate. By contrast, in the United States, the First Amendment is generally viewed as a defensive right against the state. And so the big information platforms say, we are speaking. I, Facebook, am speaking when I decide what to show to my users. I, Google, am speaking when I determine who should rank where in the search results. And as a result, it becomes very tricky to regulate those kinds of providers. And so in general, sort of American constitutional law establishes a lot of barriers to the government intervening to encourage diversity. That doesn't mean that it never happens. So for example, in broadcast regulation, there are precedents where the court has said, well, we do think that the First Amendment does include the goal of making sure that Americans have access to diversity of sources, and that has at times included taking affirmative measures to preserve diversity. With respect to the internet service providers who argued that we are speaking when we transmit users' data packets, and we have the right to be the editors of our users' internet connection. In the same way that a newspaper edits what articles are online, we, the internet service providers, have a right to determine what our users get to see. There, the court said, no, you know what? When you transmit people's packets, you are not a speaker, so you don't have a First Amendment right. So it's not a problem with respect to ISPs, but it will be a problem with respect to the information platforms. And so before, streets, sidewalks, the traditional public forums were public forums, and so it was easier to get at them under the First Amendment.
Jillian, you talked about the problem you had with nudity. How transparent are Facebook and Google and others about how they're watching? Is this done at all by machine now? Is it done by large groups of humans? Do we know?
We know a little bit, but we don't know everything. So content moderation on these platforms is a really interesting thing. There's some excellent new research by Sarah T. Roberts, who's written about the concept of commercial content moderation as a labor issue. What we do know is that human eyes right now look at most of the complaints. We know that companies rely on users to police each other. They call it community policing, which is a term directly taken from kind of inner city America and is quite problematic. And so they rely on me to report you, basically, or vice versa. Once that happens, it then goes to an individual who looks at the content, makes a very quick determination, probably a split-second determination as to whether or not that content should stay up. And I'm generalizing because it does differ a little bit from platform to platform. But what we know now about algorithms is that some of these companies are now utilizing them to be the first responders. And so what that means is rather than me having to see a beheading video in my feed and report it to a platform, there's now an algorithm that's employed to do that. So it would locate that video, point it out to the platform. The content moderator or human would still look at it. But then it would also hash that image. In the case of terrorist content, this is an agreement between some of the companies. It would also hash that image and make it, put it into a database and make it identifiable to the other companies who could then decide whether or not they want to use that information and take it down. Now, again, we may not have an issue with this being used for terrorism, but imagine this being used for speech, being used for nude imagery, being used for any other kind of thing, and I start to have a real problem with it.
Jillian, what about Facebook Live? How are they handling that?
I don't have much information on that. I mean, I think what it comes down to is that these companies aren't very transparent at all about how they handle terms of service or community standards complaints. So as Microsoft president said earlier today, all of these companies have produced transparency reports, and they're quite excellent when it comes to what governments are asking of them. So if a government asks for a user's data or asks for a piece of content to be taken down, you can go to Facebook or Google or Microsoft and find kind of some information about what that looks like in those countries. But when it comes to terms of service takedowns, we know nothing, absolutely nothing. And that needs to stop. I've been calling on these companies, as well as many others, including Rebecca McKinnon, to be transparent about their terms of service takedowns, and I think it's beyond time.
So,
You have one fan over there. There we go.
So the rapid progress in deep learning technologies, particularly with visual stuff, obviously is probably already being deployed. But what's so interesting, in the last panel, Richard Stengel posed this idea of algorithmic approach to qualifying information, which brings up the lack of progress, I would think. This is a question perhaps to Prateek or Jennifer, in natural language understanding. Chatbots today, for example, they're poor. They basically don't do a very good job, which suggests there's a long way to go before you could get technology which could do an adequate job of, how would you, in the situation of free speech, what do you limit? But is it technologically realistic to think about it as a possibility?
It's definitely a war of escalation, right? The chatbots will get better as the techniques for detecting them get better, and we'll get better at utilizing other data about the social networks connections that those chatbots have, like who are their friends, maybe they don't have any friends, maybe we should already view that as an indication that they're chatbots. I think more and more sophistication will arise on both sides. So it's a war of escalation. I don't know that we can win so easily.
I have some experience with this question in the context of trying to detect hate speech in social media, particularly in the case of the Twitter network. And I believe machine learning technologies, including deep learning, will have a tremendous role to play because the volume of the data simply does not scale for human intervention. But as Jillian pointed out, I think there's still room for a human to be in the loop, to look at the alerts that come out of the machine learning system. But there's still tremendous challenges, and we have a long way to go in terms of our technology being robust. So for example, how do we differentiate hate speech from speech that is merely critical of an individual from notions of sarcasm? And how do these notions differ across different cultures?
Yeah. So I just want to go back to your initial point. This was, again, part of the 1996 fantasy what the internet would look like. There was an idea of netiquette, which suggested we don't have to worry about spam because people will just know to email each other in ways that reflect norms about how people should behave in the internet. That was laughable. We've later seen law, the CAN-SPAM Act. We've seen technological solutions that have taken hold of spam, some of which impinge on these concerns about what's being limited. Now one issue that's a big one is we talked about trolls. We had the example earlier that if you say certain things on your Twitter page, you're going to get a whole bunch of trolls. You talked about the election. Different people have talked about this on social media. How do we handle this? This is going to require some sort of norms and shared commitment to governance. We're still very early days on how we figure out how to do this.
Barbara, going back to network neutrality, zero rating came up earlier in the conference. Does it fit into the network neutrality discussion in a meaningful way?
Yes, so zero rating is the practice of exempting certain applications or content from users' data cap. So if an internet service provider zero rates, let's say Spotify, then when you use Spotify, it doesn't eat into your monthly data, but everything else continues to count against the cap. And that absolutely fits into the net neutrality debate. When we first started to think about net neutrality, we primarily thought about technical forms of discrimination, blocking, discrimination, fast lanes. But once that was done, ISPs started to realize, well, we can reach the same effect by exempting some applications from users' data caps. And what's interesting is that by now we have a lot of data that suggests that, not surprisingly, users strongly prefer data or content that's zero-rated over content that counts against their cap. You know, the online magazine Slate did a very interesting experiment where they showed the same podcast to some users in a zero-rated way and to others while counting it against the cap. And users who were offered the zero-rated content were 61% more likely to click on the link. So that means zero rating has a strong impact on user behavior in making certain forms of content more attractive than others. And as a result, it's just another tool for internet service providers to give some applications or content an advantage over others. And so sort of some people, when zero rating first came up, said, oh, this is something completely new. We need to think of new big thoughts. And I think it's just the same thing. And so my personal solution would be to just treat it in the same way as technical forms of discrimination. So if we think allowing content providers to pay to be in a fast lane is a problem because startups, small businesses, nonprofit speakers can't pay to be in a fast lane, and we don't want this two-class internet of companies and speakers with deep pockets who get an advantage and those who can't pay, who are sort of in the dirt road. That same rationale applies to paying to be zero-rated. If I can't pay to be in a fast lane, I can't pay to be zero-rated either. And that will be a big problem if users sort of migrate towards the zero-rated content. And we are seeing those kinds of plans. Or if we have a problem with an ISP speeding up its own video app, we have exactly the same concern about this distorting competition if they zero-rate their own online video program, because that will give that program an advantage over others and therefore allows the ISPs to pick winners and losers. Around the world, to close this out, we are still trying to figure out how to deal with this. So both the United States and Europe basically left zero rating for case-by-case adjudication. The European Union actually adopted some stricter guidelines for regulators where they said very clearly, once you reach the cap, you need to treat everything in the same way, so that's when zero rating stops. And second, the guidelines very strongly suggest that singling out specific applications for zero rating, so only one or two online video platforms or only one or two social networks, that is highly likely to be illegal under the European framework. For the others, they will look at it in more detail. The US is still trying to figure it out. Canada right now has an open proceeding on zero rating, and India adopted pretty strong rules on zero rating, a comprehensive framework that basically maps onto sort of the kind of solution that I suggested earlier. But so it's something we are still very much thinking about right now.
So I'd say quickly, I would not paint this with a broad brush, and the reason before the case-by-case is, in one note that Barbara reverted to, if AT&T, which owns DirecTV, puts the DirecTV Now, whatever they call it, in the zero rating camp, but Netflix is not, they're putting a thumb on the scale for their own affiliated entity. That's sort of at one end. The other end would be T-Mobile, not affiliated with anyone, creates a policy that allows all video offerings to get zero rating. I would view that in a different camp. And so these are not all with one kind, and one of the challenges in figuring out zero rating is how do you sort the wheat from the chaff?
At this point, people who have questions, would you please come to the microphone? But I'd like to have one more point of discussion. You know, walls are not always bad. I'd like to talk about we talked about Apple versus the FBI and the encryption debate in the US, and I'd just like to see if I could ask the panel to broaden it. And because we are in a reset in the United States, so encryption is very much still on the table. And I was wondering if any of the panelists had thoughts about where we are and the challenges to having robust encryption and thus privacy.
What I can say from, I mean, I'm coming from an NGO perspective here, is that the Snowden revelations did a lot to make companies, make organizations more aware of the need for SSL encryption, for other kinds of encryption, made individuals much more aware of the need for end-to-end encryption in their communications. But I will also say that the past few months, since November, since the elections, my organization and several other organizations that I've spoken with have seen an incredible rise in the number of requests that we're getting for trainings, for more information on how to use these tools. And so while I think that the Snowden revelations were really important in that, I think that now what we're looking at is people having real fear and seeing real threats in front of them and adopting these tools as a result.
One area where I would like to see some walls come up is with respect to protecting the privacy of user data. Right, so we're seeing a lot of interesting applications that rely on population scale data. And yet these applications do not think about protecting the privacy. So what are some technological solutions that can still enable the design of these applications, but still reason about privacy from a more formal perspective?
Let me start on this side first, and then if you
Jan
want.
Fodo from Fraunhofer Focus. I want to ask a question about the legal obligation of corporation when it comes to doing business with other countries. We've talked about doing business in own countries, but when it comes, I know for a fact that in Germany, ThyssenKrupp, when they want to sell steel products to other companies, they have to verify the chain of selling that so it doesn't end up in wrong hands for, I don't know, producing weapons, so on and so forth. But we have seen that the technological companies didn't have any difficulties in, let's say, selling deep package inspection devices to countries which we know for a fact that it's going to be used against the own people and their population. I want to ask you, what is your stance on this view of working with other countries? Should it have consequences should Yahoo have consequences for applying to the censorship laws in China or not? I think.
Perhaps there's a legal aspect to this question that I'm not very well equipped to answer, but perhaps there's also a moral aspect to this question that is it ethical for say US-based or even German-based companies to be designing systems for deep packet inspection and selling it to more repressive regimes? And I would disagree with that position. I would like to see some sort of a social pressure on on these companies to broadly think about rights of all citizens.
So I don't know if Joel Reidenberg's still here, who yesterday was here, has written about this in the context of Yahoo and access to Nazi memorabilia in France. And one of the areas that makes this question so interesting and challenging, and Barbara touched on it earlier, is that different countries have different legal norms about what you might protect. Privacy, copyright, free expression, nudity, Nazi memorabilia, hate speech. And a challenge that your question takes you to is, should US law, US companies try to export US values in all countries it operates, and vice versa? Given that the internet right now is international, there's a tension about what would that look like. What Joel points out is there are some technologies, so if you go to Google France, you can have restrictions. So you might say that within technologies, whether it's Google or Yahoo, where you know you're in a country, you have to follow that country's laws. But there are times when you use other technologies, so VPN, virtual private networks, that clearly subvert that, and you shouldn't try to impose on all technologies the laws of the US, because ultimately that would be hard to sustain.
So I hear two different questions here, actually. One of them relates to the sale of technologies by Western governments by Western companies to other governments. I'm less of an expert on that, although the Wassenaar arrangement has been an attempt at regulating that. I'm not so up on it, unfortunately, but it's worth looking into. On the second point, though, and to follow up on what Phil said, I think that a few years ago, a lot of companies, Yahoo had to comply, I believe, because they had an office in France. I could be wrong about that.
Yes, and in the way I mentioned, where technically if they knew the user was in France, they had to comply.
Right. Whereas today, one of the things that we see is companies complying in places where they don't need to. The reason they do that, of course, is because the alternative is getting blocked, and getting blocked is bad for the bottom line. But personally, I think that there is a difference between, say, complying with France, a democracy, and complying with some of the less democratic countries that you can find in these companies' transparency reports.
So YouTube blocks videos making fun of the king of Thailand.
Right. Right, and so that's one good example. I think YouTube also blocks stuff making fun of President Erdogan in Turkey. And the Germans in the room will understand the controversy here last year that happened, where Germany was pretty close to complying with that as well. But yeah, we do see, compliance with the United Arab Emirates, for example. Facebook and Twitter have offices there, and I'm looking at this and thinking, why would you do that? Why would you put an office in a country that has no interest in freedom whatsoever?
Okay. On this side.
Hi. Thanks. I'd like to thank the panel, first of all, for a really nice articulation and untangling of some of the net neutrality. I really appreciated the disambiguation of the rules themselves from the jurisdictional questions, which I think is really important. But I wanted to talk about interconnection for a minute. Phil, I think you hit the nail on the head a little bit when you said we don't have to worry about Netflix and Google anymore because they're big enough. So what you've described there is actually doesn't have much to do with net neutrality at all. It actually has to do with what's called a peering dispute, right? So in peering disputes predate net neutrality by at least 10 years. The idea there, right, is that each of these parties derive some mutual benefit from interconnection, and then they basically use market forces to fight it out and figure out basically who should pay for that interconnect, how money should change hands, et cetera. And if they can't, they do what Netflix was doing before they got to be, a big guy, if you will, which was to pay for transit. And that's what the little guys would do until they're big enough to pay, until they're big enough to interconnect, is they pay for transit. The problem, as you pointed out, of course, is Cogent is one of those transit providers, and we won't go there. But I think this brings me to my question. Actually, one quick thing about that, too. A lot of this has been painted as the ISP versus the little guy. But I think we need to put it out there. It's not quite that, right? It's the ISP versus the content provider versus the Googles and the Netflixes that want to interconnect without paying transit. That said, this brings me to my question, which is, isn't this a red herring? Isn't this all really just about lack of competition? If there were more competition in the access market, then the market forces could play out in the way of a normal peering dispute. The real problem, as I see it, is that Comcast has a monopoly on the access, so they have much more power in this sort of what should be a more bilateral balanced, quote-unquote, peering dispute.
So we're talking about peering now. Barbie,
So I think I know where you're trying to go, and so one thing that was different between Phil and me was Phil was talking about peering disputes among backbone providers.
Right.
Their competition, at least if that has been sort of the US position, and many people in the market can solve a lot of problems. In the interconnection with last mile providers, competition doesn't help, interestingly. And contrary to what you were suggesting, it's not related to the amount of competition that's there for end users. And that's because what matters there is that last mile providers have a monopoly over access to their end users. So once I am a Comcast customer, the only way for Netflix to get to me is through Comcast. And that gives Comcast a monopoly over access to me. That allows Comcast to charge monopoly profits even if there is competition in the market for end users. And we know this for sure because we experienced that in the phone market in the US. So when phone markets, last mile, local telephony became competitive, Congress and the FCC originally thought that there was no need to regulate the fees for terminating phone calls by the local providers because there would be competition for the end users. There was lots of competition for end users, but the local competitive providers were charging outrageous fees for interconnection. And so what that taught the FCC, in line with this economic theory of terminating access monopoly, is that even if there is competition for end user, a local telephony provider and a local internet service provider have monopoly power vis-a-vis the interconnecting partners. And now finally, I actually disagree with you and Phil's suggestion that this is not a problem for Netflix anymore, because and Google, because all around the world, so the ISPs, if unregulated, have sort of pursued the strategy of saying, well, we just let all the unpaid route congest, and then those who want better interconnection can pay for it. And because there is no way around the last mile ISP because of the terminating access monopoly, you can find all sorts of routes into the network, but all the good ones are paid routes. And that has meant that even the large companies have paid for good quality interconnection. And to the extent that has stopped, it was generally related to regulatory intervention. And so, and I think that's a problem. You know, it sounded as if you suggested that, you know, maybe the large providers have the money to pay for last mile interconnection, and that might be a good thing. I disagree, but even if I didn't, it's very important to acknowledge the collateral damage that that kind of system imposes on everybody who can't pay. And we had very interesting data about that in the United States. During this conflict between Comcast and Netflix, it wasn't just Netflix that suffered. There were all sorts of people who were trying to who worked from home and had to dial into their company networks, people who were trying to upload payload data, sort of schools, small businesses, that were all suddenly having connectivity issues, and it turned out that their only problem was that their traffic was going through these congested routes. So part of the collateral damage that a system that allows those with money to pay for better quality is that all of those who can't pay will pay the price in the form of really bad quality interconnection.
So just to put a finer point on it really quick, I think we agree a little bit that the problem is in the terminating access monopoly. So why focus on regulating the interconnect as opposed to, say, unbundling the last mile or introducing competition in the last mile in other ways?
But unbundling wouldn't solve the terminating access monopoly. So that's exactly, that still leaves every single customer with the individual ISP with a terminating access monopoly over their customers.
A question on this side.
Okay. So net neutrality actually focused on the convergence of access and content, right? And I think as this panel demonstrated in a beautiful way, it also has a leverage to enforcement. So now we see a new dimension of convergence between access content and enforcement, some of which is provided as a service by some of these online intermediaries. And so I think it's really important to bear in mind also that in some cases, and YouTube Content ID would be an example, the provision of enforcement services as a business model would become a barrier on competition. And so just to look at the access and content would be a little bit misleading. And so I think, one of the questions is how to hold these online intermediaries accountable. And that was in the panel. And Phil, you actually ask us to consider some voluntary measures, such as the ones of the 6 strikes procedures adopted in the United States. They were adopted actually under a threat of regulation, and were actually, of the SOPA people that failed, right? So it was voluntary, but only when you knew that there were regulation out there that would come. And actually they failed. They just announced the closing of the system. So my question is whether this is a viable, voluntary accountability could exist without regulation?
So there's a lot of literature on this, and for those interested enough, I have a recent paper that speaks to this. There's some very successful efforts for voluntary efforts where consumers understand who the good actor is. So the LEED standard for buildings is an example where it's voluntary for people to follow it. There's also now, following on that standard, different forms of public encouragement. And so there is that model where something voluntary can get enough traction and they get encouraged. There's the other model, which, as you note, the copyright alert system follow, where you've got some legal regime, like the repeat offender requirement in the DMCA, or the threat of a SOPA PIPA, which was never too much of a threat, thankfully, but that will lead actors to say, let's avoid regulation through something. And then there's a third category where voluntary efforts are under a regulatory regime. So they emerged in different situations. Some of them can work well. Others don't necessarily work. For those who want the details, you can read my paper.
Let's hope for 2 questions. Go ahead. One question, I'm sorry, okay.
You're very honored. So my question is about net neutrality within the global context, specifically within an international developmental context. I'm thinking specifically of Facebook Free Basics. And I guess my question really is, how do we balance a need for technological development within the global south, and the potential economic and social opportunities that come with that? How do we balance that with questions of net neutrality? And if we should be addressing that balance, what would you guys seek to do about that? Thanks.
So Free Basics, for those of you who haven't really heard about it, is a zero rating program where Facebook has opened its program to all providers who make changes to their content, to certain technical requirements to become part of Free Basics. And then the idea is, even if you don't have internet access, you can get access to the content that is part of Free Basics. And that happens through deals that Facebook has with individual ISPs. And when Facebook first suggested that, they were saying they think that's an important way to close the digital divide around the world, because they said a lot of people don't really know why they should subscribe to the internet, and Free Basics will give them sort of the possibility to experience a subset of the internet, and then hopefully they'll like it enough to upgrade to the paid internet. So first, I probably disagree about the description of the problem. It seems to me that many people don't subscribe to the internet because either there is no internet access where they are, or it's too expensive. It's not generally that they don't know why they should want it. beyond that, there are very real problems with that approach. And India, which ended up banning free basics, actually highlighted both of them in a very nice way. They said, on the one hand, we are concerned that many people will be stuck in free basics, and free basics will always only include a subset of the internet, because to jump through those hoops to meet Facebook's technical requirements requires real work. So startups, small businesses, low-cost speakers that we think benefit particularly from the open internet will not become part of free basics. So we just see the big players, and that means users will be stuck in a second-class internet. That worries us. And second, it's a problem for all of those who want to speak or commercially interact with those users on free basics and who are cut off from that. And so India said, well, if there was no other alternative to solve the problem, then maybe we would have to accept that that's a good solution. But the Indians said, well, the way Facebook free basics is structured, it's not as if free basics pays for the data. That's the ISP's sort of cost. And so the Indian regulator said, instead of making this data available for people to use with free basics, why don't you make the same data available, and then people can decide how they want to use it, using, for example, some of those mobile browsers that automatically strip out most of the data-intensive content. And so the Indian regulators call this application-agnostic zero rating, where they said either you could give people 10 megabits per day, 10 megabytes per day, or you can use for free from this time to that point time, or unlimited access to 64 kilobits per second. So those kinds of application-agnostic ways that give users access to whatever they want to do online without creating problems for everybody else in getting to those users. And I personally agree that those are much better ways to try to get at that problem than trying to do free basics, which has all sorts of other problems, like having a single point of failure where governments can go and interfere because all the data goes through Facebook.
Not to mention censorship, of course.
Yes, censorship. So I see you want to stop.
Way over time. Please join me in thanking our panel.